Hello and welcome back to the Experience Lounge podcast, episode 35 today. I've just double checked, it is episode 35. Lovely to have you all back with us, and I hope everyone is doing well. Laura, how are you? How has your week been?
It's been good. I feel like on the podcast we talk a lot about the weather in the UK, but if you're British, I think you would know why. It's been a lovely summer, and actually I feel sort of optimistic and looking forward to the next season, which I think is probably one of the benefits of moving back. We were going to talk a little bit about this. We did a masterclass for Be Next this week, and this is sometimes I think some of my favourite type of sessions where we get to work together, because obviously that doesn't happen very often, and I really enjoyed it. The sort of a live ideation exercise in there and a presentation, and actually the reason for the topic today is because it just got me thinking, actually, even after that podcast, that there is a real role to play in terms of how you can sort of galvanize your HR function, but specifically HRBPs around employee experience. So no, it's been a good week. What about you?
Yeah, I loved it as well. I thought it was really good. And it's really interesting to see there's such a boom in the EX course space. And I think it's really exciting to see the kind of content, the course structure that people are coming out with. I know we've had Luma. We love Luma. We've spoken about that before. IDEO have got some stuff, but interesting to see the kind of HR providers coming more this way. I'll be interested to see if like CIPD, SHRM release their own
start to do
EX type of course. Let's see. But other than that, I'm all good. I am getting bigger. My face is getting fuller. But we're 5 weeks away from D-Day.
Exciting.
So the day he gets his official eviction notice, although it is the night of the Singapore Grand Prix. So it'll be very interesting to see if we get a taxi from our plane through.
Which hospital?
Novena. So
okay, so you're gonna
okay. I feel like Singapore is so organized. They would have thought about the main roads being clear and stuff. So, and it's not like we're stopping off, or much to my husband's dismay though, because he had tickets for the F1 on the Sunday, and I'm like, sorry, you're not going. So he's had to sell those. But otherwise doing good. I'm wrapping up. I'm going on maternity leave in a couple of weeks, and I'm ready for it. I can't wait.
Nesting. Begin nesting.
Exactly. Yes. All of that good stuff, and just hopefully where I can, relaxing a little bit. But hey, otherwise doing well. So let's get into the topic of discussion. Actually, before we do, this week, the week we're recording, was the People Matters HR, Tech HR. I think I'm saying that correct.
Tech
conference in Singapore. Now, I didn't go because I'm heavily pregnant and I'm frightened to death of COVID.
You've had it 3 times.
Exactly. Not great. Again, as we said, don't pick me for anything. But have you had any feedback? Did you hear some good stuff? I've seen loads of stuff on LinkedIn.
I saw loads of stuff on LinkedIn. And obviously the last couple of years, I did join. I think they were doing it. They must have been doing it virtual, because I remember joining some of the events virtually when I was still in Singapore. Yeah. And this is the first one, I think, in the last 2 years that's been face-to-face. But yeah, it looked really good. I saw loads of people posting about how good some of the speakers were and the conversations, and some big names there as well, I think. So yeah, it looked really good. And exciting, I think, especially in a market like Singapore, to see those kind of events back, right? Sort of shows more of a shift to in person, which is good.
Yeah, I think it's really good. I will say, because I always have to have an opinion that's slightly abrasive, I do think conferences need to do a bit more to be a bit more creative, though, I will say. And that's not targeted just at People Matters, but like the same speakers, the same, why are we still talking about the new normal and future of work in the same way that we've been doing for the last 5 years? Like, really?
Yeah.
Like, I would say, had I gone, I'd probably be disappointed with the content, just being totally honest.
I think, and I was thinking again for a future episode, the dialogue now around future of work really seems to, in the last couple of months, just pivoted again to a whole different conversation around that balance, I think, between the collective as an organisation versus the individual and your preferences and wants and needs. And there's a real kind of tipping of that. And I think that's the struggle for organisations at the moment. And Absolutely. It's different to, I think, maybe 6 months ago, the conversations we even had on the podcast about future of work. So I was thinking that's a topic we should bring back, because it's tough in terms of
Absolutely.
what's the best thing to do.
I agree. But if you're going to get me to a conference, you know what I want? Case studies. That's what I care about.
Yes.
I care
Yeah.
about hearing how organizations have done something. And
Mm.
sometimes you get that with technology vendors when they sponsor sessions, and they'll talk about, like, you know, how they
Yeah.
implemented X and delivered Y. But more of that stuff, I think, rather than the kind of regurgitation of the same thought leadership. But again, nothing
Agreed.
personal,
No,
just
I
general.
think that's true. And actually, you're right. Like, when I did quite a lot of speaking events at ServiceNow with
Mm.
case studies, and they were good, I think, at
Yeah,
doing
really good.
real life examples. And you learn loads. I remember, going to ones both in Singapore and London, and just hearing loads about Coca-Cola, like big brands who were doing some really interesting stuff that you learned a lot,
Mm.
and also the kind of pitfalls of some of those implementations, which is
Yeah,
always helpful, so you don't make
always
the
good
same
to know.
mistakes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So,
Yes.
today we're going to be talking about the role of the HR business partner in driving a better employee experience. So, let's kick off with question one then. Laura, what are some of the skills that HR business partners should be building and developing to help them support their organization's EX strategy or agenda?
So I think context for this topic, and sort of, for me, it's actually a really sort of pertinent topic at the moment, actually, because I moved into a regional head of HR role in January. So I lead a team of business partners and sort of matrix broader HR function alongside EX. And it's something even more recently that I've kind of been grappling with, in terms of, if we're thinking about future looking skills in HR and the role of the HRBP, where does EX play a role, and what are some of those skills, and how can we get HRBPs to develop them? So, in sort of reading around the topic, and even prepping for the episode, there was one article that I came across that was written, I think, about a year ago or so, from My HR Future Research, so David Green's Insight 222 organisation, and they talked about 9 skills of a future
Mm.
HRBP, of which, very interestingly, I think, for us in the context of employee experience, 3 came under what they described as experience led, and they were human centered design, EX implementation, and digital literacy. And I think they're all very much skills when we've talked about EX strategy, or we've talked about, how do you do journey mapping, all of those kind of concepts around employee
Yeah,
experience. But I guess when we've talked about them often, I think we've talked about them in the context of EX
yeah,
practitioners, or where, like I have had in the past, a dedicated employee experience team, and you had UX UI designers who
yeah.
weren't actually HR people, that had that kind of human centered design background, and we're using that methodology in HR. So the shift here
Mm.
for me is building that set of skills and capabilities within your kind of core HR roles, and
Yeah,
also those individuals that are going to broker the relationship with the business. So they're the people, and I've experienced this in the last 8 months, they're the people that are closest to the business in terms of understanding and needing to have, I think, that commercial acumen to understand where the business is going,
yeah,
but also, for me, the real kind of cutting edge would then be if your HRBPs could then bring in human centered design thinking, ways in which you could use EX design to problem solve
yeah,
with the employee at the center. Then I just think, imagine if you could untap that. That would be huge. So
yeah,
that article really sort of resonated with me. The other bit I was sort of reflecting on was, I think there's a skill versus will point in some of this, and that traditionally, if you look at kind of HR models, so if you go back to the 90s, look at things like the Ulrich model, you sort of see that HR business partners historically might have done more possibly transactional type work. I think obviously the evolution over time now is more consultancy, advocacy, that kind of business acumen lens, like being super important.
Yeah.
But there is still, for sure, and I experience this, the nature of the role that means you do get arguably some quite transactional type queries come your way, and where possible
Yeah.
you do push those into your service center if you've got that set up. So you might sort of have your tier 1, tier 2 in your service center, but the reality is you do end up dealing with some of those queries yourself. So but I also think historically, in my experience, some BPs like that about the role. So I do think there's a piece here around the need to develop those skills, but also in
Mm.
terms of who you've got in those roles. Are they the people that
Yeah.
are open and willing and see that as this is the future of HR? So what do you think?
I agree with you. I agree. I think it's really interesting because I come at this from more of a project angle. Like, it's been a while since I
Yeah.
was a BP myself, like well over 6 years now. But I think often what I find in EX transformation projects or even EX technology projects is that the HRBP can often get in the way. And
Yeah.
not, you know, I think so. So I think with that in mind, there are two skills in particular that I think are really important. The first is the change piece, right? So,
Mm.
kind of enabling BPs around what role do they play in change and communication and driving the behaviors that we want to see, particularly if it's like an EX tech implementation or, even things like
Yeah.
changing the onboarding experience, for example, like how do they support their managers? Because sometimes I think that HRBPs themselves become their own kind of persona group that the rest of the
Yeah.
EX project team have to end up, coaching and trying to drive change with anyway. And so we want to get them into a space where they don't inhibit the progress of the project or the transformation, and actually they are helping us. And sometimes I find that's a struggle. If I look back over some projects that I've done more recently, you know sometimes HRBP requirements can be incredibly complex and put forth their own requirements before those of the people they represent, and not
Yeah.
really thinking about the people that they represent when they're talking about their demands or needs or something from an EX transformation project perspective. So I think change is really important. And I think, what role do they play? What kind of message should they be putting out? Even in the face of decisions that don't necessarily benefit them or maybe create a bit more work for them to make the employee experience better, how do we make sure that that's a positive message that's going out to the business? Because sometimes I think that's a challenge.
Yeah.
And the second one is digital literacy, which I think is, again, this is probably just over the last couple of years and kind of project experience, is sometimes I find the HRBPs I've worked with are lagging behind in terms of digital skills, but also their willingness to engage with technology that drives a better employee experience. So I also think that that's a huge opportunity for HR organizations everywhere, is how do we ensure that we're not dragging our BPs along with us, that they are totally bought into the employee experience technology roadmap, they understand where we're going, they understand the purpose of the technology that we're putting in place and how that will benefit them and their people. So I think it's awareness around the digital tools, but also getting them confident using those tools. I think I'm working on a research project at the moment, which is very much around like reparations to a system that was
Mm.
implemented last year.
Yeah.
And, we're having to explore challenges for end users as a big persona group, but also people partners as a
Yeah.
separate group. And so, how do we make sure that they are fully enabled, they feel confident with whatever you're implementing, they feel comfortable with the change? I think those are kind of top of mind for me. But again, I think my opinions are being shaped by some project experience more than anything. What do you think?
Yeah. I think actually the point around digital literacy, I thought a lot about this recently, and again from the context of my own experience, because I've been on the other side. So I've been, like, most of my career in the last kind of 8 years or so has been big system
Yeah.
implementations. So I've very much been the project team driving that forward. going through, cut over, post go live, etc. So very well versed in how that all works. And my experience now is being on the other side. So
Yeah.
being the kind of regional head of HR for a large region with, and also quite a strategic region, I think too, with a team of HRBPs. And what's been super interesting, because we're about to go live with SuccessFactors Employee Central, and what's been super interesting for me is viewing it from a different lens. And actually, I've been trying to bring in, and I think you get it in the questions that I'll ask, trying to bring in my knowledge of previous system implementations. So, asking things like why are we not getting HRBPs involved in service rehearsal, as an
Yeah.
example. And I guess sometimes asking more technical questions than you'd probably expect to sort of traditional HRBP. But the
Yeah.
thing that I was most reflecting on is, how do you instill that knowledge, other than the only thing I can think is almost rotations, or trying to get, BPs, because I think you don't experience that level of what it takes to bring a really complex piece of tech over the
Yeah.
line without having been in that project space. So for
Agreed.
me, one of the suggestions would be, well, we should be thinking more about, I suppose, almost in a kind of gig economy, swapping roles around, short-term assignments. But
Yeah.
I wonder, do you have any other views? Because I sort of was reflecting on this and sort of getting a bit stuck almost of how could you build that a bit more, other than seconding somebody to a project team, basically.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't know, there are a couple of thoughts I had, and actually we were probably going to get to them on our third question. But I think having HRBPs less as a kind of customer in a project and more of a key stakeholder is one. Easier said than done, though. So, like, making sure that you've got BPs involved in things like your steering committees, if necessary, making sure that they are fully part of discovery workshops, those kind of things. They're involved in the review of requirements and those kind of things. So you're driving those behaviors where they're actually learning on the go. And of
Yeah.
course, that requires some supervision. I think the other thing, and I haven't fully formed this opinion, is kind of BP accountability. So if you make them accountable or responsible for the success of an implementation for their area, will that get them more bought into the project? And they have to then get involved. They have to understand the solution, because
Yeah.
it's going to become a fundamental part of how they're measured. Again, easier said than done. But what do you think about that approach? Would that work for your team?
Yeah. I think it would. And I think there's almost something about the shift from a HRBP almost being the sort of custodian or the gatekeeper almost to the business, and how do you involve the BP and equip them to also be the voice of the employee? Because some of where I've seen perhaps tension between project teams and business partners is, I agree with you that sometimes it's almost that there's a sense of like, we've always done it this way, so therefore we have to continue to do it that way. That definitely happens. But I do think there's a piece of, how do you really make sure that BPs feel engaged, part of the process? So almost bringing them in as that group. But if they had the skills
Yeah.
that we're talking about in terms of, the EX design, the employee voice at the center, if all the conversations were about that as the experience, then I think you'd massively change the dialogue, because everybody's focus would be, what does that impact, or how is that going to change for the better
Yeah.
the employee experience? And if it doesn't, then why are we doing it?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think maybe that's the piece. But I do still think, like I said, the biggest learning is being involved in a project. So
Yeah.
I think
Absolutely.
if it's possible in your organization to be able to move people around in those roles, that would be the biggest learning for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I
On
think you're
both
right.
sides, I think.
Yeah,
Definitely.
agreed. So, question two. how can HR business partners, so any of them listening, or if they're like you managing HR business partners, start to build some of those EX and EX design skills and capabilities so they become experience led? What do you think? Where would you get started?
So I would say, and we've talked about this a lot on the podcast before, but I would say starting with learning some of those human-centered design techniques. So we've talked about Luma. There are others that you could do in terms of training, but I would sort of say to start there. I also just think an interest, though, if you're sort of thinking in terms of external thought leadership around HR as a function, the future of work, there is a lot of material out there in terms of how HR operating models are going to change. And I would almost say, if you're thinking about your own career and development plan, have you got a section on that plan that is actually about the future of HR, the future of work? So there was a paper, and we can link some of these, the research I referenced for Insights 222, but also this Deloitte paper, which is a couple of years old now, but it was around exponential HR. And that talked about that we'll see the emergence of super jobs. And some of those would be things like workforce experience architects or solution architects. And when you kind of look at the descriptors of the roles, they're very much EX design, agile ways of working, creating end-to-end solutions, bringing experience across the enterprise. So I would say, as a BP, think about how do you start to build some of those tools and techniques, and think about the why. So why is it important? Because actually a lot of the external thought leadership tells us that this is the way that organizations are going to head. So in the next 10 years, having those kind of experience-led parts of your role are going to be super crucial, in the same way that I think the evolution of the business partner role has been around sort of consultancy, commercial awareness. The piece about human-centered design, employee voice, employee at the center, I think is also going to be really key.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's lots of others. What do you think?
No, I agree with you. I think I also think just trial and error is a good way of doing this, right? So if you're a HRBP and you're listening to this and you've got an issue in your area of, I don't know, you're seeing particularly high turnover, for example, like that's a great opportunity for you to practice running like a focus group or like an experience research campaign. And like, it doesn't need to be super fancy, nor I would say, does it need to be aligned to kind of the broader research strategy that your organization has. Like, you can just go out and start doing that really informally, like send out a diary invite, get as many people from your representative organization that you're supporting together, and start to practice doing it. Practice makes perfect. And I think you'll then become more comfortable with that kind of voice analysis, really looking at the data, getting different perspectives, and then representing your area when it comes to coming up with those solutions as well. So then collaborating with other teams to come up with, okay, well, I'm experiencing attrition issues in my part of the business. I've done some light research. What do you guys think? Is there something we can do cross-functionally to try and come up with something that will work? So I think practice makes perfect, and not being frightened to go into it. But of course, actually having that backing of a Luma Institute kind of practitioners training would be really helpful. Or you can there are also a bunch of really good design thinking books. If you head over to our Instagram account, we actually have a dedicated reel to our favorite design thinking books. So there are plenty there, and you can pick up so many different skills, facilitation skills, but also just kind of getting your head around that human-centered design thinking framework. So I think that's also important. But I think, coming back to my point around digital literacy as well, I do think, because I think it's such an important part of the employee experience, the tools that we give our employees, I think there is something to be said about ensuring, like, if you run a team of HRBPs or you're heading up a HR function, ensuring that your HRBPs understand the employee experience technology landscape and spending some time educating them on the digital interactions your people have and why those solutions are in place, and also what is on the roadmap for future. Because I think the more BPs know the value of the technology, why it's coming in, how it operates, and also kind of what investments you're planning on making in future to improve that digital employee experience, the better. and the less kind of resistance you're likely to get as well, if people understand why we're bringing in a new solution or why we're changing something. And I don't want to harp on too much about that. And I'm well aware this is kind of coming across as, oh, Sasha's had a bad experience with BPs on a technology project, which is true. But I do think it's important, and I think it's lacking. And this is multiple different project experiences, same trends I'm seeing with the business partner community, particularly for large organizations, is that sometimes they do create roadblocks when it comes to implementation of technology in particular. So I think the more we can educate people on the value of EX tech, the easier it will be. What do you think?
No, I think that's fair, because my experience is similar, that has been challenging. I do think there's, if I sort of think about what's the potential, or where could you tap in if you did really unlock the BPs having that digital literacy, the EX thinking. For me, I think it's almost then some of the linkage to CX, because as we've said, the BPs are at the heart of that kind of that understanding of the commercial outcomes of the business, and they would be key players. That would be such an important voice if you sort of understood the EX field, kind of how you kind of problem solve in that way, and then also brought in that kind of commercial focus. I just think the potential would be huge in terms of what you as an organization could then achieve, because what you've then got is you've got people that have really important relationships with key business stakeholders that could keep bringing that sort of employee voice into a people and business strategy. So I think that's almost as the why do we need to do it. I think that's the killer bit that we almost don't have, if it almost becomes EX practitioners often leading that EX strategy. But I do think the bit you said about the digital literacy, I've definitely experienced that. On the flip side, I'd also say there's something, and maybe it's a skill in that project space, of trying to sort of tap into where are some of the concerns or resistance coming from, because sometimes actually the points are valid, but it might be the way in which they're being delivered, or if somebody's kind of coming across as a roadblock, that can be sort of more challenging. But actually there are certain things that I think can be a bit overlooked in that project space too. So it's sort of the balance, absolutely. I think, a bit on both sides. So
I totally agree. And I think often in the project sphere, we look at business partners as a stakeholder in the project, and we assume because they are part of HR that they will be totally aligned with the direction of the project. And it's that assumption that leaves us open to the resistance and us overlooking specific challenges. So I agree, there are definitely opportunities on both sides, 100%. I think we could talk about, actually, we probably will have a podcast episode dedicated to implementations and BPs as part of the change. But jumping to question 3 as we wrap up, what would your advice be to organizations looking to focus more on building those experience-led capabilities in HR?
So one thing I would say, which I always say, is, and you sort of alluded to it actually before when you said it doesn't have to kind of be a big fancy piece of work, because I would say to start small. So I think one of the things in that BP role is you will have a sense of hypotheses around whether it could be related to attrition, it might be related to talent management, performance management, because you will see inevitably in those BP roles data, you'll have access likely to demographic data, attrition data, all of that kind of stuff. So I would sort of say start with identifying some of those hypotheses, and then pick some proof of concepts to kind of work from, and use then some of the human-centered design techniques in order to test those hypotheses. So like you say, it could be something as simple as some focus groups, it could be going out and doing some interviews with colleagues, it could be doing roundtables with a certain group or demographics in the organization, whatever it might be. And I'm sure also nowadays most organizations would already have annual engagement surveys. They'll have some type of employee listening data there, maybe pulse surveys, using some of those again as a sort of starting point to say what is the voice of the employee here, and how can we build on some of those
Yeah.
findings and try to sort of understand in a bit more detail what's sort of going on there. And the key thing is,
Mm.
as we always say, going out and talking to employees, involving them in that process, and sort of iterating as you go, I think
Yeah.
is key.
Yeah.
What do you
I
think?
agree. I agree. I think the only thing I would also add to that is like leverage the skills that you have in your team. So if you're a HR leader and you've got an analytics team, for example, like they would do a fantastic job of running some enablement sessions for your BPs
Yeah.
on the value of people data and how to interpret data, both qualitative, quantitative, how do we build up those skills? Likewise, if you have an EX team, like, getting them to train or enable or offer some coaching and mentorship to BPs as well. Like you can get pretty creative without having to bring in independent consultants. Although if you do, hit me up. Going on maternity leave, but I'll be back. You can start to build that kind of knowledge sharing internally. And actually, I think that's quite healthy because then if you have a BP who's particularly inspired by your EX team, they go away and they run their own small little research engagement. They're more likely to come back and then ask for guidance or counsel and support from your EX team. So there's a really nice kind of collaboration opportunity as well within your team. So I think, yeah, that's the only other thing I would say is just tap into the skills that you've got already within your organization. And absolutely, this is a really, really, really important investment. Like, as you say, the articles that we're referencing, they're not new. Like we've been talking for a while
No.
about the role of the HRBP becoming more design led, but I'm not seeing much in the way of that acceleration in organizations. Like I don't see it as a priority.
Yeah, agree. I think that's fair.
Mhm.
I think it is a really good point about how do you, as a BP, bring in some of those other parts of HR, like your C of E
Mm.
function. And if you are lucky enough to have either, your own EX team, or you can bring consultants in, yeah, how do you use those to kind of bolster the offering
Yeah.
around that employee voice, and how do you solution? I think the other thing, one kind of final almost bit of advice, and if I'm being really honest, something that I am starting to work through myself, as I say, somebody leading a team of BPs, is creating capacity for them to be able to A, do some of this work, but B, the crucial thing, deliver some of the changes.
Yeah, you're
Because
right.
I always think it's all very well and good us going out and doing a bunch of research and understanding what the challenges are, but if we're not then
Agree.
actually making changes to the experience, you might as well have
It's always
not gone out and
time.
asked people.
Yeah.
So for me, it's creating capacity in the function and in that BP space. And that's also where I think for them, in terms of kind of work satisfaction, growth and development, that's
Yeah.
where I think some of the really interesting work would be, in terms of, that delivery. For example, if we were looking at the very relevant return to work experience as a new parent, if you were involved as a BP in making some of those changes to the experience, I think that would just be so satisfying
Yeah,
from
so
a,
rewarding. Yeah.
yeah, exactly, from a kind of growth and development perspective. So that would be my other kind of nugget, is how can you create the capacity? And some of that for me comes from, where can you take the kind of busier work away that probably isn't as value add,
Yeah.
in order to create the space for them to deliver against some of these initiatives.
Yeah. Absolutely agree. Really, really good point. Awesome. Well, that wraps up our episode dedicated to HRBPs and employee experience. So, a huge thanks to Laura for surfacing this one as a topic. I think it's really important and pertinent. And so, if you're listening and this is something
Yeah.
you're grappling with or you're thinking about, reach out as well. I'd say definitely more so Laura than me, area of expertise here, and kind of you can share how it's worked for you, or if you're thinking about it as well. So, do reach out. As always, make sure you're liking and subscribing. Follow us on Instagram. We're super active over there as well with lots of content. And if you are thinking, how is this going to work out when Sasha pops out a child? Well, the good news is we have a number of episodes that will take us up until
We
likely
do.
the end of November. And then we will see how we go from there. So don't panic. We've got lots of people coming in for interviews, which is really fantastic over the coming weeks. And we've got lots of fun episode plans as well. So,
We do.
yeah, make sure you're subscribed and we'll see you next time.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.